grow it just like we grow all of our other crops. The issue is more that it is a baby.
Hello, Jen. Thank you very much for joining us at the NYHI Network. If you could, before we get started, please tell people who you are, kind of why you're in hemp, and we can then get started from there.
Sure. I'm Jenifer Gilbert Jenkins. I'm the professor of agricultural science here at SUNY Morrisville. I specialize in soil nutrient management. That is my background, but I do all things agronomy related and crop production related. And so since I have been here at Morrisville in my first fall semester here, I was approached to start in on hemp research, and I've been doing it ever since. And so we've mostly focused on nutrient management for grain and fiber crops, although we've done a little bit about pest management, focusing mainly on weeds, not so much on insects, other than just cataloging instances of pest pressure. And our horticulture department has expanded into the CBD realm, but we've really focused, my program has been mostly on grain and fiber.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, grain and fiber seems like it's going to be a pretty big future for the hemp industry in the United States.
I am
slowly
the
growing.
biggest supporter of the fiber industry. It is my favorite thing to get up on soapboxes and rant about. I just think hemp fiber is so cool.
Yes, it is. It has so many uses, so many possibilities.
And
Absolutely.
I think I actually love it more for the agricultural side of it than I do for the uses. I think that it fits so perfectly into our agricultural system here in New York.
Yeah.
So
yeah, the row crops versus horticultural growing, right? Everybody.
Particularly just the timing of fiber as opposed to grain.
For the growing season, you mean like how many days and planting and how wet it's going to be and all that kind of stuff. Interesting.
So much.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's speaking of row crop farmers, so they're either planting right now or they're getting prepared they're preparing their fields to plant. So there's kind of a few things. I mean, we could go over like just some tips on what they can kind of be focusing on. I mean, this probably will mostly pertain to row crops, but I'm sure some of it will be able to have like a correlation to cannabinoid, CBD, all that kind of stuff. So kind of specifically, like what sort of field prep measures should they be taking? Like what things should they be doing to their field? What's the best thing to grow on? Like, do they need to plow it? Is it no-till? All that kind of stuff.
I think the most important thing to be monitoring in the spring is soil moisture. I was on a call with Ruben Stone of Uniseeds last week or week or two ago, and he was talking about them already planting in Canada then, right? So 2 weeks ago, because hemp is not sensitive to the cold. It'll do fine when the nights go down to freezing temperatures. That's not a big deal at all. But what it is sensitive to is excess soil moisture. And unfortunately for us here in New York State, those two things go hand in hand, because often before leaf on, our water table is so close to the surface that the soil is just way too wet for us to plant. And so we're not really waiting for a specific soil temperature to be able to plant. We're really looking at soil moisture. And as soon as the soil is dry enough to plant in, that's all you have to worry about. You don't need to be concerned with the nighttime temperatures going below freezing. That's not a big deal.
Interesting.
Right, so the hemp can really tolerate that well. So that's your focus in the spring, is figuring out when is that planting time available. As far as preparing the field, there is no one right way to do it. So just like every other one of our crops, you can grow this crop no-till, and you can grow this crop minimal till, and you can grow this crop conventional till, and it does well in all of them. I have seen that managing the amount of residue on the soil is important, that if there's too much residue, the hemp has a hard time coming up through it. But
what do you mean by residue?
Dead cover crop on the surface.
Okay.
Right? Because you can't do no-till agriculture without cover cropping. Those two practices go hand in hand. And so if you're doing one, you should be doing the other. Well, you can do cover cropping without no-till, but you can't do no-till without cover cropping. And so if you're doing no-till, then there's going to be some amount of residue of your dead cover crop on the surface. You can plant green and roll into, I mean, there's all sorts of practices that are common to every row crop production system that applies to hemp as well. But there being some amount of dead material on the surface is important to help fight weed pressure, but too much residue on the surface will prevent the seedlings from emerging. So
Gotcha.
it's a sweet, happy spot in the middle that we're looking for.
Gotcha. Interesting.
As far as fertility, most of our row crops in the state are seeing some amount of manure over the winter, and like all of our nutrient management plans, accounting for the nutrients coming from the manure is important. Some amount of phosphorus and potassium, usually somewhere around 40 pounds, is important at planting, but really that's going to depend on manure applications. And then a nitrogen application after the crop is up is going to be the best timing for that.
Gotcha. Interesting. Yeah. So no method is the perfect method, but there's many different ways. Would you say it's pretty much similar to like growing corn?
Is it similar to growing corn? I think nutrient recommendations are going to be similar to growing corn. I think practices are probably more similar to growing small grains because it's a smaller crop, and so you're planting on 7.5-inch rows, not 30-inch rows. And just like in every other crop, there are arguments about row spacing, but I think it's a better comparison to say that it's similar to growing our small grains.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And in terms of that, I'm sure there's a variation on this too, but how deep roughly do you want to be planting the seeds, and like what kind of machinery should somebody be using to be planting?
Right. So it's a small-ish seed, but it's not a super small seed. So what's fun is that when you try and figure out which box to plant in when you're using your planter, it can go either in the small grain box or the large grain box. It really doesn't matter. We tend to plant it using the large grain box. I just had better luck calibrating it that way. But this year I'm going to intercrop cowpea with it and look at some nitrogen benefits from the combined crop. And so cowpea seeds are really big, and so those are going to go in the large box, and the hemp is going to go in the small box. And so that really depends on what your equipment is. So that's if we're no-till drilling the grain. You don't have to no-till it.
Mm-hmm.
It's happy somewhere around 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch deep. That is enough to protect it. It has adequate moisture, but it's going to germinate and emerge rather quickly, and usually on the order of about 3 days. So it's not like a 7-day crop. But for many of our crops, the reason it's 7 days is because you're planting at 1.5 inches, not at 1/2 inch. So you're planting somewhere around 1/2 inch, maybe 3/4 inch. But if you don't have a drill, you can broadcast hemp seed. So we have broadcast and rolled the seed and had very successful establishment. The problem with broadcasting the seed is that it's a really healthy seed that lots of birds like to eat. And so keeping it well established, like that's been the problem, is the other species that are like, ooh, yum, yum, yum. So that was a little bit of a problem for us. But what's sort of interesting, one of the years that we broadcasted, it was really dry. And so it wasn't germinating, and then it rained and it all came up. And so that's the nice thing about hemp seed, is that if the moisture content is not high enough, it'll just wait. Mm-hmm. And then when it gets to the right moisture content, it germinates and everything is happy. If it's too wet, you'll kill the seed.
That's interesting. So the heat doesn't really play too much of a factor.
It's all moisture.
So if I'm mistaken, is hemp a photosensitive crop versus a heat sensitive crop, whereas other plants are heat sensitive to determine like when they go through different stages?
It's both.
It's both.
It's both.
Okay.
So you can't count growing degree days like you can for corn, which is only a heat sensitive crop and is not photosensitive.
Gotcha.
Right? So it is a photosensitive crop in that the hours of dark are going to trigger it. So as the hours of dark increase, it's going to be triggered to go into its reproductive stage. But it is heat sensitive. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Okay, so it's heat sensitive in that if you have a really cold growing season, like 2 years ago, we had a July that was super, super cold. And then all of a sudden in August, it warmed up and we found summer again and the crop just blossomed, right? It was huge. It just shot up. And so so yes, it is a photosensitive crop in that the hours of darkness increasing are going to trigger it to going into the reproductive stage, but it still needs those heat units to be able to grow and
Gotcha. I see.
an amount of to be able to do photosynthesis essentially.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to know that both components will determine how much growth you get in a growing season.
Interesting. Yeah, more and more like, so people have the idea that it's a very easy plant to grow because it's called weed in certain realms or all that kind of stuff, but it's actually incredibly challenging to grow. But on the flip side, it also is very rewarding in terms of what it can produce, and it can produce a wide variety of things.
I don't know that it's incredibly challenging to grow. It just requires really specific conditions. Gotcha. And so if you don't have the right conditions, it's not going to grow well. But if you have the right conditions, it's going to grow really well. I don't want people to think that it's challenging to grow in that you need certain skills to be able to grow it. You grow it just like we grow all of our other crops. The issue is more that it is a baby. And like especially in those first couple of weeks, it's so easy to destroy the crop from excess moisture. And in those first couple of weeks, drought can really stunt it, and it's a little bit more protected from drought than it is from excess moisture. But if that drought persists, it'll kill it just like it'll kill any other crop.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, because I remember, I think it was also 2 years ago, my first year of growing, that it had a really dry spell for a wide period of time, and it was not growing at all. Like the plants grew like about that tall. They definitely germinated before it got really dry. And so that's probably why they survived.
June was totally dry, and then it started raining, and it didn't stop for all of July.
And it just shot up, and that was crazy. So it's better dealing with drought, but like how long of a period roughly from the time that you plant the seed to the time that it's like strong enough to kind of withstand drought and deal with, like, I don't know, the extra, I mean, I'm sure at some point in time too much moisture would kill it, even if it's growing past that time, but like how much time does it need to grow, or even like to beat out other weeds or anything like that?
There's so many answers to that. Okay, so I'm going to take that backwards.
Okay.
Let's start with weeds. Early on, so my initial first 2 years of research on hemp showed that if weed seed emerged at the same time as the hemp seed, that every single weed seed outcompeted hemp. So whether it was pigweed or lamb's quarter or mustard, it really didn't matter. Every weed seed would outcompete the hemp. Once you get to, I would say 8 to 10 leaf stage, right? So once you get to the point where the hemp plant is growing its own canopy, then it's able to shade out its competition and does much better at competing against weeds. So you're probably looking at like 5 weeks in before you're getting much competition. And that's why good weed prevention early on is huge, huge. It completely changes the outcome of the crop.
What are good methods for weed protection? I mean, especially since you have, I mean, I think I heard something about the laws were changing in regards to the weed killers you could use, but essentially it's still roughly outlawed.
Well, you can't use weed killers on hemp because hemp isn't able to tolerate it, right? We have Roundup Ready corn and we have Roundup Ready soy, which means you can spray Roundup and it'll kill the weeds and not the corn and soy, right? So that's the reason that you can't use herbicides during the growing season. You can kill a cover crop with whatever you want because you're not applying it to the hemp, you're applying it to the cover crop. So we have had the best luck with killing our cover crop, and we kill our cover crop with Roundup because we're not an organic farm, but we kill our cover crop 2 days before we plant. And while the cover crop still, it takes longer than that for it to appear dead. So we kill the cover crop and then plant into it, and the hemp comes up beautifully. We, by mistake, on accident, poor timing, seeds got caught in customs for a month last year. On one field, killed the cover crop 2 weeks before we planted. And those 2 weeks were enough because Roundup doesn't really kill weeds anymore. It just delays them a little bit.
Stunts their growth.
Particularly with our perennial grasses. And so that field was able to come back. And so when we planted into it,
it was too late.
The weeds were just all ready to come right back. And so these 2 fields, the one that was killed in 2 days before it was planted was right next to the field that was killed 2 weeks before. The field that was killed, the cover crop was killed 2 weeks before. The crop was maybe 2 to 3 foot tall on average. And the field where it was killed 2 days before was 7 to 8 foot tall. And so it just shows you the impact.
The specificity.
And it shows you the impact of weed pressure. That managing weed pressure is huge for this crop. And so for us, it comes down to killing the cover crop with Roundup, and then that residue is there to block the other weed seeds. But also there is, you can roll and crimp the cover crop if you're organic. There's other ways of doing it to make it so that you're managing the weeds. But weed pressure, particularly in organic growth, is one of the most important contributors to loss of yield. So I took your last question first, and now I don't remember the questions that went before that.
It was primarily just like targeting what's like we talked about the depth of growth or the depth of planting.
Oh, you were saying when is it stronger, right? And so somewhere in that 4 to 5 week range, you have a canopy there, the roots are deeper, and so they're reaching a little bit more at other water. Drought's going to affect it like any other crop. It's just not going to die immediately, and so prolonged drought will still kill it. If we had a case where we had drought again, because it feels like, we've been dealing with this excess moisture the past couple of years, but the ability to irrigate once a week would be great. I think people need to be careful about excess irrigation, particularly when you're growing under plastic, that you increase pest pressure, fungal pathogens, and the like, and then also pressure from excess moisture in the soil if you irrigate too often.
Gotcha. And kind of on that note of irrigation, and even before irrigation, so since the moisture levels are so necessary to be kind of precisely tuned when you're planting, when it's growing, what are those roughly, if there's even an answer?
What is the right moisture level? I mean, I would say the soil's field capacity. But so field capacity is a term that soil scientists use. I'm not sure that that is a common term
Does
used.
that mean essentially how much water the field can absorb before it starts letting water off? Like it just becomes runoff?
Sort of. Field capacity means the amount of water that can be held in the soil against the pull of gravity. So it's how much water remains in the soil after 24 to 48 hours of drainage after it's been saturated. Right, so that means that the pore spaces have some amount of air and some amount of water, and that is the ideal time. If a way that I tell my students to think about it is think of the soil like a sponge. If you take a sponge and you sit it in a pan of water and the pores of the sponge are completely full, when you pull it out of the pan of water, it's going to drain and drain and drain, right? That's water moving due to the flow of gravity. It's going to stop draining at some point, but that sponge is still going to be wet. And if you squeeze that sponge, water will come out of it. That's plant available water. That's the water that the plants can take up. And so that amount of water in the soil, field capacity, is the sweet spot where there's air in the soil, but there's not excess water that's going to rot out the roots.
Gotcha. So essentially it's that if there was excess water, then the roots wouldn't be able to get air. So it's not necessarily specifically the amount of water, but the ability for the roots to be able to get air along with water when it's in the soil.
I don't know the answer to that question for hemp. I don't know that anyone has looked into exactly why, because not every crop is as sensitive to the amount of moisture in the soil. For instance, we have lots of wetland plants that have adapted to grow with their roots sitting in saturated soil. So I don't know that it is necessarily the ability of the roots to get oxygen out of the soil, or whether it is the young roots are really weak and therefore can be susceptible to rot. I don't know. Yeah. I've never actually done the research to know why it's so sensitive to excess moisture. I just know that it is so sensitive.
Gotcha. So we essentially need more data on that. And then so now this may be another question you can't necessarily answer because we need more data on it, but
a lot of those answers, it's a lot of fun. Like,
well, yeah,
I don't know.
mean, that's somewhat the exciting thing about the hemp industry is that there's just so much to learn.
The exciting thing.
Like
Absolutely.
There's so much to learn, so much to dive into, but that's like also the complete downside of the hemp industry, because there's so much to learn and we need to do it in such a hyper speed because other industries are already at like max scale.
And because of that, you get bad data, right? Because there are people who want to say like, I did this one study, and in my one study where I had no controls and no replication, I saw this, and now you should know that that's the answer. And I look at that at people trying to like spout data from where there was a thing that I saw once that said anecdotal evidence is not data, right? The fact that I grew this once and I saw this, that's not scientific data, right?
There's so many variables.
Replications. And so it makes it so that there's a lot of bad information out there when most of the science is saying, yeah, we don't know the answer to that question yet, just sit tight.
Yeah, it's all going to take time. And so to ask that question, I'd imagine that different soils would have different, what was the word again, or the term? Field capacity. So like clay soils might have different field capacity or like rocky soils, or like, so like, I don't know if you've grown in different soil types, but what kind of things have you seen just from growing in different field types?
So hemp wants your best soil, right? Everyone who says that like hemp is gonna save the soil and it's gonna heal the soil and it's gonna do all these like magical, mystical things. It's not. It's a crop just like every other crop, and it is a crop that wants the most fertile, best drained, richest soil that you've got. And so it's going to have stunted growth in a heavy clay soil because of water movement or the lack of water movement, right? It's going to have stunted growth in excessively sandy soil. because it'll be too droughty and it won't be nutrient rich. And so you want that perfect high organic matter, loamy soil that every one of our crops is fighting for.
Gotcha. So yeah, it's not going to be able to grow in that vacant land behind your house.
No.
As said, so in those respects, totally kind of not random, but in those regards, if you were to plant a hemp plant in that backyard soil, that's just random, would you actually, I mean, I'm not saying a healthy plant, but would you get a plant, do you think?
Sure.
Yeah.
It'll grow, right? Just like we can get the crop to grow anywhere. The question is, what's your yield going to be?
Yeah.
So if we are backyard enthusiasts, which are not allowed to grow hemp, but
Yeah.
if
Well, you
we
can get
are
a license
backyard enthusiasts that just want to throw some seeds in the ground and see what happens, you're going to get a crop. But that's the same thing between like my garden and a vegetable producer. I do all sorts of random wacky things in my garden because I'm curious and I want to see, and my livelihood isn't based on my yield, right? I'm just going to be bummed if I have a few less tomatoes to can at the end of the growing season, right? So it's not that you can't grow the crop, but if my livelihood depended on it, I would want to be doing all of the steps to make sure that I'm maximizing yield. And so I might be a little less wacky in my garden because I want to make sure that I'm going to get that full yield for my labor, from my crop. And so it's not that you can't grow it. It's that you're going to get a decreased yield. And if your goal is grain, you're so on a plot scale, we can see small plots getting up to 1,500, 2,000 pounds of grain per acre if you had multiplied that out, right? At field scale, we're seeing anywhere from 800 to 1,000 pounds of grain per acre, right? But on crappy field scale, where things have gone wrong, we're getting like 200 pounds of grain to the acre, right? And so if you're just a backyard enthusiast who just wants to be like, I grew hemp, right? Then who cares if you only get a small amount of grain? You can just be like, look, that's grain right there. Isn't that cool? And pop off the seeds and chew them, right? But if you're trying to grow the grain so that you can produce hemp oil or so that you can make a granola bar or something like that out of it, then you want as much grain as you can get, and so you don't want to just throw it in whatever ground you have.
Absolutely. Yeah. Interesting. So, so we covered field prep. So farmers, as long as they're, I mean, so you can plow right before you plant hemp too, and all that kind of stuff. You just have to use.
Yeah, if you are going the conventional tillage route, people will tell you that you want to prepare your soil just like any other crop, where you're gonna, plow it and then disc it so that it's a nice smooth surface, so you have really good soil to seed contact. We have had very good luck with minimal tillage. I won't say that we'd say that we do no-till. We really do minimal tillage because we do use some airways, but still we're not disturbing the whole surface. And so it really is what method you're most comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So there's multiple methods that will work. It's just whichever method you choose, there's some specific parameters. The moisture content needs to be at field capacity, right? That's the term. The heat, what temperature roughly, like, because so I remember, and this is after it was already established, but one year you guys were growing hemp and you had like 300 acres of corn and like 80 acres of hemp, and I remember frost came through and like killed off all the corn pretty much, but like the hemp
at the end of the growing season, but the hemp was like I took these great pictures I called my hempsicles during the day, where the seed heads were just covered in frost, and then normally it would take a day or two to see frost damage on a plant, and you might see one of the older leaves got a little necrotic, but really hemp is very tolerant of frost. And so I don't think that you're really looking for any specific soil temperature. As soon as the soil moisture is available, you want to get that crop in, and you want to get your grain crop in as soon as possible. because the longer that it can grow before it goes into its reproductive stage, if you're looking for either grain or fiber, right? The longer the growing season you give it, the larger the plant, the more energy it has, the more grain you're going to have, the more fiber you're going to have. If you're looking for a grain crop and you're okay with not maximizing your yield, but you want to be able to combine it more easily, then you don't want to do that. So we've been having this conversation for a while now about what is optimal hemp growth, because the sooner you get it in the ground, the better. And many of our grain varieties have been optimized to grow shorter. So you're not going to get an 11-foot tall plant, but even an 8-foot tall plant is really hard to combine. And so if you plant it a little bit later, then it will be shorter before it goes into the reproductive stage, and therefore it will be easier to combine. But you also may be losing yield doing that, right? So if you're happy on that 800 pounds per acre realm, then do that. You'll be able to harvest it a whole lot easier. If you are really trying to push it and maximize your yield of grain, then you want to get that in the ground as soon as it is dry enough.
Yeah, interesting. So
right?
so
any time in May is fair game.
Yeah.
Except any time in May hasn't happened in the past. I say that as like the best case scenario is any time in May is fair game, right? The past 3 years we've planted June 15th, right?
Wow.
Around or about.
It was long enough to get growth.
Yeah, sure. It was long enough to get growth. I mean, we certainly aren't maximizing yield, but we're getting grain yield. The issue is moisture. You know, the past couple of years we've had particularly last year, the snow cover went away and that immediately turned to rain, and it rained from the end of April until mid-July.
Yeah.
It was insane.
Yeah, not a fun time to be growing at all.
So we can talk about what ideal conditions are, and then we have to remember that it's still farming. And so we need to be flexible and manage our expectations and change input based on what we're really going to get out of it. Yeah.
And kind of on that note, so doesn't hemp seed, when it's mature at different rates on the plant? So you kind of have to take that into account as well.
Yeah, it's an indeterminate plant, which means that this grain doesn't all mature at once. And so you can sort of picture most tomatoes are indeterminate as well. If you ever seen like an arm of a cherry tomato plant where half of the tomatoes are red and then it sort of changes color to the green ones at the end, that's what hemp does.
Gotcha.
And so if you wait for all of the grain to be brown, then you've already lost half of your yield. And if you look at the ground, you'll see hemp seedlings coming up all through your field, because as soon as the seed is dry enough, it's going to drop off. If you harvest too early, there's so much green material around the outside of the seed that it clogs up the mesh in combines, and so that's a problem. And so there's a sweet spot in the middle where you're about 50% ready. And what people need to know is that this is not going to be like all of our other grain crops, that when we harvest it, what's in the hopper is clean. If you wait so that what's harvested in the hopper is clean, then you're losing way too much of your yield. And so in that hopper, it's going to be a mess. And the grain is going to need to be cleaned when you take it out. And in fact, the grain is going to need to be cleaned quickly and dried quickly, because it starts to rot within 4 hours because of how high the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids are. And so if you don't get that dried down, it starts to heat up right away. So
Gotcha.
it's a little bit tricky, that combining process. I feel like that's maybe a little bit of an understatement, but it's not impossible. Think of the thousands of acres that they're doing in Canada. They're not magic, right? It's just that they've sort of gotten used to the what's that spot. Yep, and the main solution is grain cleaners. And so you're not worried about getting it perfectly clean when in the combine. And in fact, when we had last year, we were sort of playing with that. And when the grain coming into the bin of the combine was perfectly clean, I was holding my hands, walking behind the combine, catching grain coming out the back. I was probably losing about 50% of the yield there. So then when we dropped the fan speed down so that more of that junk was going into the hopper, we weren't losing grain out the back, but we were getting much more material on the inside, because the way that combines work is by fans blowing what should be dried material out, and the grain should be heavier and go up the conveyor belt. Well, because you're harvesting it before all of the other material is dry, that doesn't work. It's heavier. So
I thought I had to do something with all the hemp seed being different sizes, because isn't that a?
I mean, that's an issue for cleaning.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, I guess that's where
you know, every step in the game, there's something else to be like, oh yeah, this is how hemp is a little bit different.
Yeah, like I think there's some RGB color or like seed sorters. They're like wicked expensive, but that might have to be a potential route. Anyway, so so kind of to start wrapping it up. So essentially, when people are growing fiber and grain seeds, three main factors they should be focusing on. The moisture content in the field needs to be at field capacity, ideally the best soil they got. The timing is important, because you want to have enough time for it to be able to go through the sun days to determine what maturity it's going to go through, and you want to have enough vegetative growth right before it actually goes through seed production. And then also the heat, because you don't want it to be too cold or it won't be able to grow, and you don't want it to be too hot or it won't get enough water and or is that?
But you can't really control that part. You just
Okay.
have to like cross your fingers at that
and
point. But I would say fertility is the other piece of that.
Yeah.
Right.
Gotcha.
Is that making sure that you are taking into account the fertility applications that you've made to your field. If you've used manure on the field, if you've used green manure or leguminous cover crops, that we're really taking into account all of the sources of nutrients so that we can apply some phosphorus and potassium and maybe a little bit of nitrogen at planting, and then come back in when the crop is about, I don't know, less than 6 inches tall, about 6 inches tall, and top dress with some more nitrogen.
So like what if you could give somewhat more specific parameters of nutrients? You said phosphorus, nitrogen, and there was something else.
Potassium.
Potassium.
So I would say our soils have a lot of potassium in them because of the clay minerals that we have, and so our soil tests should let us know, right? So for both phosphorus and potassium, there's probably somewhere around 40 to 60 pounds that we need to account for to apply of phosphorus and potassium. The crop will actually take up about 150 to 200 pounds per acre of potassium, but because of the way potassium becomes available in the soil, that doesn't all have to be in the forms of fertility additions. But how much you need to apply, if at all, should be determined by a soil test.
Gotcha.
Okay? Nitrogen we don't soil test for because it's too variable within the soil. It's constantly changing. And so what we do for nitrogen is take into account manure applications, cover cropping, and the like, to say how much nitrogen should be available and therefore make up the difference. So the crop is going to want somewhere also around 150 pounds of nitrogen. And so, and it seems like in Canada, they're saying 200 pounds of nitrogen. It seems like my research is aiming somewhere around 150, and it seems like in Vermont, they're coming out with like 125 as the sweet spot. But you know, you're somewhere in there, but absolutely not all up front, right? So that if you put maybe 50 pounds of nitrogen on at planting, that should be more than enough. And then you come back in, and when the crop is larger and ready to use that nitrogen, that's when you top test.
Gotcha. And then what about the phosphorus?
So the phosphorus and potassium you would put on at planting, because phosphorus and potassium bind really tightly to soil, so you don't have to worry about leaching losses.
Gotcha. So essentially,
200
roughly, you want roughly 200 pounds of potassium in the soil, but you may not necessarily have to put 200 pounds on because there's probably already potassium in the soil.
Yeah, you're probably not putting more than like 50 pounds of potassium, maybe 40.
Okay. And then you're putting about 150 pounds of nitrogen, but that's not all at planting, right?
Right.
Okay. So you're planting,
And that can be, that total number is going to be brought down by how many manure applications there have been,
Gotcha.
what cover crop you used. And so that's the total amount of nitrogen that needs to be available to the crop. That's not necessarily your fertilizer rate.
Gotcha. Okay. So essentially, farmers want to be paying attention to make sure they have enough nitrogen in the soil based on all the manure that they spread or any other fertilizers they've used. Do a soil test to make sure they have potassium in the soil and phosphorus in the soil. Then make sure the moisture content is at field capacity, like that term, and then make sure that the timing is proper so that it has enough days to do vegetative growth.
Yeah, I mean, and it sounds like a lot, but really it's the same thing that we do for every crop.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure most farmers listening to this will think it's pretty straightforward to understand. I guess the more challenging part is getting the license and then getting seed. So that's
and even getting seed isn't that hard anymore.
Yeah. It's
if you're growing grain and fiber.
Yeah. If you're going for cannabinoids, you're rolling the dice.
It's still the wild west.
Yes, absolutely. Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Jen. It's a pleasure to speak with you, and it's
my pleasure.
You over the years. And it's always great to get the information on what you've learned so far and how to plant this and how to grow it. It's ever changing.
I was hoping on to do a good field day over the summer, though I'm not sure that we are going to be allowed to do that. And so at some point over the summer, maybe we can collaborate on a virtual field day where I take a camera out into the field. And
that'd be great. That'd be great. Put a GoPro on your head.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I just feel like it's so much easier to talk about this when we're with the crop and seeing what it's doing and making those comparisons out in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely have to look forward to that. Cool. Well, thank you very much, Jen.
Sure. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us on the NYHI network. If you enjoyed the video or you found it helpful, please like and subscribe below. If you're interested in growing the hemp industries here in the United States, please join us at the HIA at joinhemp.org and make sure you check off your state chapter during sign up. If you want to find any of the links that we have below, they're in the description, and please comment to let us know what you want to learn next. Thank you very much for joining us, and have yourself a wonderful day.